Well, welcome into my study. I wanted to give you a little more insight into some of the things that are going on in Matthew chapter 24. If you had a chance to listen to the sermon that I'll preach this coming Sunday, I'm having to kind of do a quick flyover, some really difficult ideas. And if you're coming back and reading this, or you're maybe reading it with your life group or with your family, I thought there might be a few things I could give you 10 minutes worth of and then somes to think about. So this passage follows on the disciples with Jesus had been in the Temple Mount. This is the final week of Jesus' Passion. He'd come Palm Sunday into the city, been welcomed by some, went to the temple, so he comes into the city like a king. He goes to the temple like a priest, clearing the way to God. He speaks prophetically, denouncing the scribes, the Pharisees. We looked at that last Sunday in chapter 23. And then after that smackdown of the scribes and Pharisees, Jesus has this woe, this Jerusalem, this the lament for Jerusalem, and then they leave. If I were the disciples, I probably would be feeling a little, well, that was awkward, coming out of that season, maybe even looking over my shoulder, wondering whether the temple guard is coming after us with swords drawn, because that was quite the scene. And so I'm not sure, but I've wondered whether or not the disciples are like, how about them Blue Jays, oh, look at the temple, isn't that lovely? Is that why they pointed out the temple? I don't think it really matters, that's just my imaginations. But it sets up the context then for this next teachable moment from Jesus. This has come to be called the Olivet Discourse. It's the fifth sermon that Matthew has recorded for us. The first one is the Sermon on the Mount, up near on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. There are a total of 5 sermons that Matthew has constructed his gospel around. This is the 5th one, the Olivet Discourse, or the Sermon on the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives are just out of Jerusalem, across the Kidron Valley. Jesus makes this statement in response to their comment about the temple. It says, actually, it's all going to be destroyed. And so then he's sitting on the slopes of the Mount of Olives, presumably looking out across Jerusalem, and the disciples come to him and say, when is this? We'll just read it exactly because the words matter here. When will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And I kind of divided our discussion on Sunday. I will divide our discussion on Sunday into 3 categories: that which we know for sure, that which we really don't understand and don't know, or at least there's a significant difference among the scholars, good Christian scholars, very different opinions about what some of this means. And then what's our takeaway from this? What do we live in response to these words, this teaching of Jesus from the Olivet Discourse? So in the first category of that which we know, that we know, is just the stuff that Jesus says very plainly. He says, watch out that no one deceives you, verse 4. And we say, okay, he says, people will come in my name, saying that they're messiahs. You'll hear wars, rumors of wars. Nations will rise against nations. There will be famines. These are just the birth pangs of the end, he says. So he's kind of answering the disciples' questions, but we also come away saying, I'm not sure he really answered their questions, and he's actually going to get to at least part of that for us here in a minute. But he's saying that things are going to be difficult. So a couple of things that we made a note of. One is that watch out, don't be deceived. We've just been talking about Pharisees and scribes whom Jesus says have been deceived. He calls them blind guides, blind fools, blind men, and says they're in danger of hell. So we do not want to be deceived, right? We want to walk in truth. We want to walk in the light of Jesus. That's one of the points here. Another thing that Jesus is pointing out here is that he doesn't want his disciples to be surprised when carrying out the mission that he has given to us is difficult. So there are several things here that we can know. If we jump down out of that first section of Matthew 24, we know, verse 36, that Jesus himself didn't actually know the hour, or the day or the hour, when the end times will come. Only the Father knows this. So there's much that Jesus does know, but that is something that he says he does not know. And so it should kind of jump into that third category for us of what do we do next? Well, it should tell us that we better not spend too much time trying to figure this out. When is this going to be? The signs. There have been some very sad examples in history where people have said Christ is coming, and here was the date that they would give, and they embarrassed themselves. In many cases, it caused great hardship for their followers. Don't do that. Let's not be obsessed by these end times considerations. And with that caveat, then, let's look at some of the things that are said in this middle section, verse 14 through 41 or so. One of the things that I mentioned on Sunday is that this language is really difficult to understand. And many scholars are convinced that, in part, this is apocalyptic language. Apocalyptic language, like the book of Revelation, portions of the book of Daniel, much of the book of Ezekiel in the Old Testament. Daniel and Ezekiel are Old Testament prophets. Much of those writings are apocalyptic. In many cases, an angel took the author into heaven. They saw grand things that they didn't understand in full, at least. They come back and they write about them, and they have to use grandiose language. It's full technicolor. It's surround sound stereo. It's like looking at an abstract painting and trying to put it into words. And so the apocalyptic writings there's a couple of characteristics of them, though. One is that I would suggest, scholars suggest, it's best not to overinterpret them. They're intended to communicate something that is a little otherworldly, and while there may be some historical catch points, most people get really messed around when they kind of try to date and time these things. So a couple of things that you might be helpful. I didn't say this. I won't have time to say this on Sunday. Verse 15, when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel. So Daniel, apocalyptic literature, some of that language is being drawn on here. Abomination that causes desolation, most scholars look to an event before the time of Jesus, when Antiochus Epiphanes, a Seleucid ruler, kind of following after the Greeks had come through and destroyed, captured, taken over much of the known world. Antiochus Epiphanes came into the temple in Jerusalem and slaughtered a pig on it and worshipped other gods in that space. The Maccabean revolt was part of this period of time, and Jews rose up. They said, this cannot be. It's defiling God's temple. It was a very bloody, very horrible period of history for the Jewish people, though they did get about 150 years of independence before then the Romans came and kind of said, okay, enough of that. You are going to be under our ironclad rule. So is this not something that already happened? Or is it something that was about to happen? Jesus' words here, spoken about AD 30. Matthew is writing and recounting them about AD 62. Now, there are some scholars that argue it came after the destruction of the temple, AD 70. We'll leave that for another time. I think the earlier date is the better date from everything that I've read. But with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, horrible, horrible season again for Israel's history, AD 66 through AD 70. Once the Jerusalem was conquered and the walls were being torn down, the Romans came into the temple area and they made sacrifices to their gods and declared Tiberius to be superior, to be the emperor. What was that? What was being described here? And are these events all describing a historic reality around the destruction of Jerusalem? Well, that could be. And if you, the era that I grew up in, the kind of church environment that I grew up in, was an era when they said, no, this is mostly, if not all, about the future. This is about the Great Tribulation. At the very end of the age, Christ is going to return. The tradition I grew up in suggested that at the beginning of the tribulation, 7 years of tribulation, Christ would return, take the church to himself, 7 terrible years, and then Christ would return and establish a 1,000-year reign, it's called the millennium from Revelation chapter 21. And then would be the final judgment of Satan and his demons after that 1,000-year reign after the millennium. That's called the pre-trib, pre-mill dispensational view. You don't have to write that down. But maybe you're familiar with that. I came in seminary to be convinced that I wasn't sure that we were going to be preserved from those 7 years of tribulation, and I would have described myself as a historic premillennialist, that we would have to endure the 7 years of tribulation, then would come the 1,000-year reign of Christ, and then he would set up his eternal kingdom, bringing judgment to Satan and the powers of evil. Many people that I know also hold a different view. It's called the amillennial view of the end times, and it suggests that the coming of Jesus was the beginning of the 1,000-year reigns. 1,000 years is just a figurative term. We are in the millennium, and increasingly the reign and rule of Jesus is going to be experienced, and then Christ will return. I'm not convinced of that view myself, but what we do with some of these things can have some influence. If you are convinced that Christ could return at any moment, there will be an extra urgency in your evangelism, perhaps. Now, if you're an amillennialist, and you say, actually, I think we're in the end times, and these things are just going to kind of slowly get better and better until Christ returns, then there's an urgency to kind of really see the practical work of Jesus done in the here and now. Feed the hungry, care for the poor, be active in our communities in redemptive ways. Now, I happen to think that all of those things are true, that we're to expect Christ's return imminently, that he could come pretty much at any time. And I'm convinced that we are to be so intricately involved in our community that they would miss us desperately if we were taken away. Anyway, that's a little bit of an introduction to some big questions, and I put it into this category that it's really hard to find many scholars that agree together on some of those. And so I think it's part of the reason why we are to hold this very lightly, not spend a lot of time trying to figure out what this is. Rather, we're to be vigilant, and we get down to the last portion of chapter 24. We're to be those faithful and wise servants who are attending to the master's business vigilantly, because we are expecting him to return. We're going to come back to more of this next week when we get into chapter 25, because chapter 25 is integrally connected to chapter 24. And we have lots of fun as we look at the parable of the 10 virgins, parable of the bags of gold, the parable of the sheep and the goats. All right, have a great time as you open Scripture. I hope you can open Scripture with someone. Bless you, and bye for now.